In 1958, I was one of dozens, if not hundreds, who were wrongfully detained in mental asylums across the United States. I know how it sounds, believe me I do, but I was not crazy. A simple mental evaluation would have proven that. But unsurprisingly, nobody thought to administer one. Even after all these years, I can recall it vividly. My good-for-nothing, downright rotten ex-husband, Alan, had accused me of attacking him. He claimed that one day I had just snapped, and that when he tried to calm me down, I raked my razor-sharp nails across his face. He even had the scars to prove it. I couldn't comprehend his motives. Even now, I still do not understand what drove him to commit such a depraved act. What had I done to deserve such a demented punishment? I will never truly know the answer. Alan died in 1987 from acute lymphoma. May his soul burn. I was devastated when the judge handed down my sentence. Back then, we didn't photograph every minor detail of our lives like young people do today. Forensics hadn't progressed to where they are now either, which meant that it was Alan's word against mine, and the evidence was stacked against me. The court has deemed Elizabeth Annette Mueller a significant threat to herself and others. After detailed evaluation, she has been ruled unfit to stand trial. To prevent further harm to members of the general populace, I hereby order her to receive indefinite treatment at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, formerly known as the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum. No, I wailed, tears streaming down my face. Your Honor, I'm not crazy. You have to believe me. Please, just give me a chance to. The judge held up his hand, effectively silencing me. His eyes locked with mine, his upper lip curled into a snarl. Mrs. Mueller, my ruling is final. I wish you the best with your rehabilitation, he smirked, showcasing rows of jagged yellow teeth. I glanced over to my then husband, tears clouding my vision. I'll never forget what I saw. A smug look had overtaken his countenance. It was as if we were playing an intense match of chess and Alan had won. Why? I squeaked, my voice thin and brittle. Why would you do this to me? I'm your wife. You were my wife, he replied coldly. Once you're admitted, I will file for an annulment. I really do hope you receive the proper treatment, Elizabeth. You deserve nothing less. I was given 24 hours to make my preparations. Just one day to say goodbye to my friends and family before being carted off to an unending purgatory. Needless to say, I was inconsolable. Liza, everything will be okay. We're going to fight this tooth and nail. Mom told me for the 100th time. Yeah, your mother's right. We both know that you aren't capable of such violence. We will stop at nothing to bring you home, Dad assured me, tears brimming at the corners of his dark brown eyes. My lower lip trembled. I couldn't contain my own tears any longer. Mom, Dad, I don't want to leave you. I don't want this, any of it. It's not fair, I cried, sobs racking my body. Mom gently rubbed my back, staying silent. If you can't get me released, promise that you won't forget about me, okay? Dad pulled me into a hug, holding me tightly. Mom joined him, wrapping her arms around both of us. Liza, we could never forget you. No matter what happens, you're our daughter and nothing will change that. Your mother and I will love you forever, even in death. Mom burst into tears, her steel resolve finally crumbling. I wish we could stay like that forever, that I would never have to leave their sides again. But of course, that isn't how things played out. When my parents finally released me from their embrace, a white panel van with the words Trenton Psychiatric Hospital imprinted on the side sat idling behind me. A sense of impending doom crashed over me once again. This was it. My life as I knew it was about to be over. I gazed at my parents as two burly men clad in white began stalking up the driveway. I'll never forget that image. Dad's lips were pursed, attempting to conceal the permanent frown. He stared at the ground as the men approached, an intense sorrow swimming behind his pupils. His arm was wrapped snugly around Mom. It appeared as if she hadn't even noticed our visitors. She had covered her face with her hands, but even so, a steady stream of tears flooded through her fingers. It felt like a sick joke. What had I done to deserve such a cruel fate? "Mrs. Mueller, it's time," a deep voice grunted. I turned to find the pair of behemoths looming over me. Their cold, unwavering stares bore into my psyche, disapproving frowns etched into their faces. Something in me snapped. At that moment, the reality of my situation finally sank in. This wasn't some twisted nightmare, it was real. "No, I don't want to go, please don't take me," I sobbed, attempting to flee back to the safety of my parents. The men seized my arms, preventing my escape. "I'm sorry, sweetie, we'll visit as often as we can. We love you," Dad said through teary eyes. As they dragged me away, I could do nothing but stare at my parents' somber faces. I kicked and screamed to no avail, and before I knew it, I was being tossed into the back of the van, left to peer through the back window as we departed. I watched helplessly as the outline of my parents grew further and further away, until eventually they disappeared from view entirely. The ride to the facility was spent in silence aside from my occasional sniffles. Dad's final words repeatedly echoed through my mind. "We love you." I didn't say it back. God, why didn't I just say it back? I didn't know when I would see my parents again, yet I couldn't bring myself to utter those 3 simple words. "Look there, miss," the driver said, snapping me back to reality. "That's where you're going to spend the rest of your days." A massive, multi-story building loomed on the horizon. Dark clouds swirled behind it, lending to its eerie ambience. The red brick exterior was weathered with age, and vines snaked up and down the sides. My heart dropped. The place was more closely resembled to a prison than a mental institution. In no time, the van was screeching to a halt. The doors flew open and I was forcefully shoved out of the back. One of the men grabbed the collar of my blouse and violently pulled me up the steps. "Do you mind? I can walk with my own 2 feet," I spat, glaring daggers at the gorilla of a man pulling me along. "Sorry, sweetheart, not gonna happen. I don't trust you not to run off." I frowned, resigning myself to being tossed around like a rag doll. The front door was flung open and I was pushed through. I could sense an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The institution radiated a dreary, hopeless aura. The hallway before me stunk of rot and mildew, which was compounded by cigarette smoke wafting from the reception counter. "Your name is?" A gravelly voice drifted to my ears. The middle-aged woman whom the cancer stick belonged to stared at me expectantly, her dull, sunken eyes connecting with mine. Elizabeth Mueller." The woman sucked in on her cigarette, finishing it off. She snubbed out the smoldering butt and began shuffling through paperwork. "Elizabeth Annette Mueller, age 21, she asked, her rough, monotone voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Yes, ma'am." "Take these and get changed in the restroom over there. Bring me your clothes and any personal belongings once you're finished," she muttered, handing me a cream-colored hospital gown. I cried as I shed my clothes. The last ounce of freedom I had was being stripped away, and I was helpless to prevent it. Why was this happening? Why me? I slipped into the gown and peered at my reflection in the mirror. This was my existence now. I was nothing more than a number, indistinguishable from any other patient confined to that derelict place. As I would come to find out, however, that wasn't entirely true. I sat on the toilet quietly sobbing. I wanted as much time to myself as possible before being processed. But after only a mere minute, a loud knock rattled the door. "Hurry up in there, ain't got all day." I quickly wiped away my tears, gathering my garments. "I'm using the facilities, I'll be out momentarily." I heard a muffled grunt as the technician shuffled away. I sighed, splashing my face with water. "Okay, I can do this. I can make it out of here. Just behave and stay out of trouble. That won't be so difficult, right? Mom and Dad will secure my freedom before I know it." After reassuring myself, I exited the restroom with a newfound resolve. Dad was right, he would fight for me. It was only a matter of time, wasn't it? I plopped my clothes onto the receptionist's desk. The woman lazily glanced up at me. A new cigarette had already appeared between her fingers. "Oh, thanks, hon. Your buddies here will show you to your room." I nodded, turning back to the gargantuan man. For the first time, I thought to read the name tags pinned to their uniforms. The one who had dragged me into the building was named Samson. He constantly wore a menacing, no-nonsense expression. His balding, 20-something-year-old cohort's name was Eric. I made sure to take a mental note of that. "This way," Samson grumbled, stomping down the hall. I turned to Eric. He pursed his lips and extended a hand, motioning for me to follow his colleague. I diligently obliged. The further we walked, the more run-down the institution began to appear. Whereas the foyer looked clean, the wing that I was being herded into didn't even try to pretend. Eventually, we found ourselves standing before a thick steel door. Samson faced me with a snarl. "This is it, ma'am. Kiss your autonomy goodbye," he growled, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Duly noted. Do you have any advice for me before we proceed?" "Yeah, I got something for ya. Stay out of trouble. Make my job any more difficult than it has to be, and I'll make your life horrible. You got it?" Samson snapped, his voice echoing down the empty corridor. Eric averted his gaze. Come to think of it, he hadn't uttered a single word the entire time. "Understood," I squeaked. I had to stay strong, I couldn't let my confidence crumble. Samson pounded his fist against the door. A slot clinked open and a pair of bloodshot eyeballs presented themselves. Password? Alley Cat. I heard a grunt of approval before the rusted door hinges began to creak open. A third insanely tall man stood in the doorway. "Thanks, Wallace. Come on, miss," Samson said, continuing forward. The further we went, the more appalled I became. The wallpaper had degraded to a deep yellow with brown splotches interspersed throughout, along with intermittent dashes of blood. Cockroaches skittered across the floor, and I was fairly certain that I was breathing in spores of black mold. My heart sank. It quickly became apparent that my stay at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital would be much worse than expected. We marched onward until we reached a section with rooms on either side. I curiously peered into them as we passed. To my dismay, each appeared to be filthier than the last. Every room boasted a twin bed with a thin metal frame, a sink that may or may not have been ever cleaned, and an absolutely abhorrent-looking toilet. I immediately assumed that the facility had never even considered hiring cleaning services. Samson suddenly stopped in his tracks, pointing at one of the doors. A dingy plaque, barely clinging to the frame, read, 32B. "This one's yours." My eyes grew wide as dinner plates. Disgusting was an understatement. It appeared that I would not be provided with a blanket, forcing me to sleep on a bare mattress that was stained a dark yellow. The walls had been smeared in some brown-reeking substance, which I later confirmed to be feces, and the knob for the cold water in the sink had been snapped clean off. Just looking at my new living quarters nearly caused me to vomit. You can make yourself at home later," Samson grinned, noticing the horrified expression written across my visage. "I'll show you to the recreational area." We continued down the corridor. I didn't care what the recreational area looked like. I couldn't get the image of that putrid, revolting excuse for a room out of my head. My hope was already beginning to wane. How could I manage to survive in such repugnant conditions? Before I knew it, Samson had stopped our little entourage for the final time. He pushed open a set of double doors, revealing a large room that contained rocking chairs. Decrepit, broken-down rocking chairs. Well, those and a smattering of patients. "This is the end of the road for us. Play nice," Samson smirked, shoving me into the room. Eric glanced down at me and nodded, his eyes portraying a deep sadness. Something told me that he wasn't working that job on his own volition. I nervously surveyed my surroundings. Every pair of eyes was locked onto mine. I was absolutely mortified. Almost all at once, everybody just returned to their devices. A thin, bald man was staring at the wall, clapping every so often, as if he was a child watching cartoons. An old woman sat in a rocking chair biting her nails, her eyes darting rapidly back and forth. A younger woman, no older than 30, rocked softly in her chair, simply people-watching. I made up my mind. There had to be at least one other reasonably sane person in that asylum, and I was determined to find them. I approached the woman and claimed a seat beside her. My heart thundered in my chest as I built up the courage to speak to her. "Hi, my name's Elizabeth. What's yours?" The woman turned to me and smiled. She was pretty. Long blonde hair fell past her shoulders, and I could tell that she had at least attempted to keep up a decent appearance, as much as one could in such a decrepit cesspit at least. The woman's ocean blue eyes connected with mine. Her voice was like a melody as it drifted to my ears. "Oh, I know you, darling. I know all of you. I am but a vessel for my lord Beelzebub. He lives inside of me just like he lives in each and one of you gathered here today. He will come for you. He will come for you. He will come for you," the woman shouted, devolving into a wild laughing fit. I slowly backed away as her cackles crescendoed. I needed to be more careful. Suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I slowly turned to face whoever it was. I was shocked to find that the man who greeted me looked normal. While most of the other patients wore a variety of expressions ranging from anxious to vacant to utterly depraved, the man before me seemed calm, almost too calm. "Hello there, my name is George," he said, extending a hand. I cautiously accepted it. "Elizabeth, the pleasure is all mine." "Look, Elizabeth, I'm not sure why or how you ended up here, but you seem lucid enough. My friends and I," he said, gesturing to the amicable-appearing man and woman sitting in a corner, "are just about the only people who have retained our sanity in this whole godforsaken dump. We would like to invite you to join us, before one of them gets a hold of you, that is." When he put it that way, it was really a no-brainer. "I would be honored to make their acquaintance," I replied, flashing him a weak smile. "All right then, write this." Before George could complete his statement, a sickening thud erupted from directly behind me. I spun around and nearly fainted upon realizing where the noise had come from. An enormous man had grabbed the devil woman's skull in his hand and began relentlessly bashing it into the concrete floor. "Shut up! Shut the heck up!" he screamed, pounding her face into the ground again and again and again. Panic surged through my veins like venom. The woman never stopped laughing, not until the light had faded from her eyes and her features had been mashed to a pulpy, unrecognizable amalgamation of crimson flesh, bone, and teeth. I had never witnessed anything so violent, not even on the television. I stifled a scream, and then I watched all the rage begin to drain from the giant's face. A sense of horror quickly washed over his countenance. He gazed at the dripping skull gripped in the palm of his hand before dropping it to the ground, tears stinging at the corners of his eyes. No, I'm sorry, I just wanted her to shut up, he babbled, speaking to no one in particular. I did it again, oh God, I did it again, he sobbed, dropping to his knees, his gargantuan body trembling uncontrollably. Things aren't looking too good for either of them, George muttered, staring at his feet. What do you mean, what's going to happen to him? I asked, awaiting a response. You'll see. Seconds later, Eric and Samson appeared along with 2 other technicians dressed in all white, aside from the blue protective gloves covering their hands. The squad rushed over to the wailing man. Samson produced a needle from the pocket of his shirt and jabbed it into his arm. The man howled in pain, but he was helpless to stop it. The others had his arms and legs pinned to the ground, immobilizing him. Did they just euthanize him? I mumbled. No, just watch, George retorted, his eyes glued to the scene before us. They waited for a moment as the perpetuator's cries began to devolve into weak whimpers. Eventually, the crew stood, pulling the sobbing wreck of a man to his feet. His eyes were glazed over and 2 of the attendants had to help him walk. What did you do to me? He slurred, groggily placing one foot in front of the other. No, don't worry about it. You're gonna be fine, Samson grinned, patting him on the back. The group proceeded out the doors, opting to return later for the woman's desecrated body. Samson followed as his fellow caretakers took the man away. I made eye contact with him as he left. For a brief moment, he smiled at me. It wasn't a warm, inviting smile. No, that was the disturbed grin of a man who enjoyed his work a bit too much. I stood there in shock, my mind racing. I had just witnessed a murder, and a violent one at that. Elizabeth, are you all right? I know that was difficult to see, George said, gently resting a hand on my shoulder. No, how could I be? I whimpered despondently. Yeah, that's normal. You'll need to process what you've seen on your own. But for now, let's at least take your mind off of it, shall we? Come with me, I'll introduce you to everyone. I numbly followed, unable to rip my eyes from the twitching mass of skin and flesh leaking blood onto the floor. Elizabeth, George said, tearing my attention from the mangled corpse. Yes, my name is Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. A young man with bright red hair in the tail end of his 20s, if I had to guess, chuckled to himself. A bit prim and proper, are we? You hail from a prominent, wealthy family, I presume. I stared at the man in equal parts shock and disbelief. I was still trying to work through the atrocity that had just unfolded before my eyes, and on top of that, this guy who I had just met had the nerve to mock me. I was at a loss for words. The woman standing beside the grinning man rammed her elbow into his ribcage. Oh, what was that for? He wheezed, doubling over in pain. You can see the poor thing is traumatized, and your response is to make fun of the way she speaks. You should be ashamed, she growled, glaring at him all the while. Sorry, he choked out. Yeah, you better be. I apologize for him. This is Robert, but I like to refer to him as Dick. It suits him better. You've already met George, so that only leaves me. My name is Mary, it's nice to meet you, the woman said, offering me a handshake. I graciously accepted. It's nice to meet you too, I replied, smiling meekly at her. So, if you don't mind me asking, how'd you end up in the loony bin? Robert inquired, straightening himself up. George raised an eyebrow. Well, my ex-husband falsely claimed that I had attacked him. I did nothing of the sort, yet the jury was convinced otherwise. I still don't understand. Why would he do this? Hot, stinging tears brimmed at the corners of my eyes. I couldn't stop them from flowing down my cheeks. Mary gingerly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. I leaned into her warm embrace as she waited for me to finish sobbing. I had needed that. Hey, if it makes you feel any better, Robert landed here because he thought he summoned a demon. Turns out that he was just drunk. A small chuckle escaped my lips. It shouldn't have been funny, but the thought of Robert frantically running around screaming about making contact with a demon was enough to elicit a giggle. Yeah, like you would know, I actually did summon a demon for your information. He huffed, crossing his arms. Oh yeah? Well, what was the demon's name then? Mary smirked, her knowing gaze boring into his sweaty face. I never asked. You never asked because it never existed, you drunk idiot. All right, you two, that's enough bickering. Mary, because you want to yank Robert's chain so badly, why don't you tell us what you are doing here? George chimed in. Oh, yeah, about that, she squirmed, immediately looking away. Do you want to tell her or should I? George said, eyeing her expectantly. Fine, here it goes. So my folks are pretty religious, right? They follow the Bible to a T. If it's not in the good book, then they don't want anything to do with it. All that to say, my relationship with my parents was turbulent to say the least. I guess all the stress or hormones or whatever did something to my brain, because when I was 17 I started sleepwalking. Naturally, my folks accused me of being possessed, and somehow I was admitted to the madhouse, not them. Completely backwards, right? Wow, I didn't know that. I only summoned a demon. You were actually possessed. Sorry that you had to go through that. Robert said, staring at his feet. Do you have wax in your ears? 1, you did know that, I've told you multiple times. And 2, I wasn't really possessed, you nincompoop. That was the whole reason that I brought up my parents' religious background. I probably do have wax in my ears. They don't give us anything to clean them out with, he retorted, a smug grin plastered to his face. You have a point there. All right, George, I shared my story, so now it's your turn, Mary said, a smile inching across her lips. I would rather not. It's not at all entertaining. Oh, come on, Georgie, enlighten us. We would love to. Enough. A tense silence suddenly permeated the atmosphere. George glared at Mary, instantly shutting down her advances. I will enlighten you someday, but not today. I'll tell you when I'm ready, he murmured. It was as if he was ashamed, like he was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what. So, if you don't mind me asking, I said, eager to change the subject, how do we stay occupied here? That changes from day to day. They give us jobs, and we only get a few hours of rec time. Aside from that, we're assigned tasks. Sometimes it's bread baking, other times it's arts and crafts. Or if you happen to get really unlucky, you'll end up with a little personal time with Dr. Cotton. Trust me, you don't want to end up alone with him. Mary shuddered as she finished her statement. Yeah, he's the worst. Lopped my finger off solely because he was bored. Robert grumbled, holding up his right hand. Sure enough, he had no middle finger. My eyes widened at the sight. That's not true, right? You're joking, I muttered, unable to tear my eyes away from Robert's missing digit. Unfortunately, he's not lying, George said, turning to me. The good doctor told me that I had a staring problem, so his remedy was to take my left eye. My jaw dropped. I hadn't noticed it before. George had a glass eye. How could anybody be so cruel? The trio solemnly dropped their heads. I wish I could say, George murmured. Our collective attention suddenly shifted. Samson and the caretakers had returned for the body. We watched in awe as they scooped up the remains, plopping them into a body bag. I was so focused on the scene before me that I hadn't noticed the missing member of the team. Hi. I immediately spun around, nearly jumping onto my skin. It was Eric. He stood there, wringing his hands like an anxious schoolgirl. He hesitantly met my gaze. Hello, Eric, do you need something? I asked. Yes, and Dr. Cotton wants to meet with you, he timidly responded, returning to staring at his feet. I glanced around, trying to gauge my new friend's expressions. Mary looked horrified. George pursed his lips, slowly shaking his head. Robert was completely spaced out. "All right," I said, turning to the group. "It's been a pleasure to meet you all. I suppose I'll see you tomorrow." And with that, I began to follow Eric's lead. George shot out a hand and grabbed my wrist. I glanced back at him, brows furrowed. "Elizabeth, be careful." Eric led me down a series of dingy corridors. Dozens of patients freely roamed the halls, paying no mind to our passing. It seemed that they weren't confined to the rec area in their free time. Were the staff really okay with allowing hundreds of mentally unstable individuals to roam the facility unsupervised? Before I knew it, we had arrived at a stainless steel door with a bolted frame. A dirty plaque beside it read, "Operating Room." A chill rippled down my spine. I didn't want to know of the horrors that took place behind those walls. Unfortunately for me, however, I was about to find out firsthand. Eric knocked once. "Who's there?" A man's cranky, muffled voice called through the door. "Eric, I brought the patient you wanted." "Oh, how lovely. Just a moment." I heard the sound of metal clinking and then deadbolts unlatching. Apparently the doctor took his safety precautions very seriously. The door suddenly swung open and my eyes widened as I drank in the doctor's appearance. He was of average height and build, likely around 5'9". His brown disheveled hair was flecked with gray and he sported a black eye patch over his left eye. He wore a white lab coat and gloves, each of which glistened with fresh blood. "It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, miss," he said, waving a hand as if expecting me to finish his statement. "Mueller, Elizabeth Mueller." "Miss Mueller, yes, I've been awaiting your arrival," he grinned, removing a glove and extending his hand. I reluctantly accepted, instantly regretting my decision. His hand was cold and slimy like the skin of an eel. Yes, it certainly is a pleasure," I retorted, eager to pull away from his limp handshake. "Eric, please wait outside," he said, finally releasing me. "I will need you to escort Miss Mueller to her room once we're finished with our chat. We wouldn't want anything to happen to her along the way, now would we?" "Absolutely not," Eric muttered as he dutifully shut the door. I felt my face drain of color upon realizing that I was now completely alone with this strange man. No one but Eric would hear me if I screamed, and even then, I wasn't entirely sure if he would come to my rescue. "Is there something more that you wanted to discuss with me, doctor?" I asked, praying that he would make it quick. "Yes, please, take a seat," he said, guiding me to his office area. It was only then that I stole a glance around the room. It was a strange layout, to say the least. 2 dim bulbs hung over metal operating tables, bathing the room in a sickly yellow glow. The perimeter was lined with an impressive assortment of pills, which sat in cabinets protruding from the walls. At the far end of the room where I had found myself sat a tiny office space, separated by nothing more than a small partition. Miss Mueller, is everything all right?" the doctor asked, eyeing me suspiciously. "My apologies. Yes, everything's quite all right. The transition from my home to this place has been an adjustment is all," I replied, pulling at the chair opposite him. "Ah, yes, I'm sure that you will take a liking to our humble institution once you're settled in," he grinned at me, and I swear that in that moment a flash of red sparked across his pupil. "I agree," I muttered. The man's gaze was beginning to make me uncomfortable. I didn't like the way that he was looking at me. "How rude of me," he shouted without warning. "I forgot to give you my name. I am Dr. Henry Cotton, the lead superintendent of this prestigious facility." He offered me a little bow. It was obvious that he took pride in his position. Color me impressed. I hadn't realized that I was in the presence of a man with such high status. "Your flattery won't work on me, Miss Mueller, though it is much appreciated," he said, winking at me with his good eye. I had to subdue the urge to vomit. I giggled nervously. Yes, I see that. So what is it that you would like to discuss, Dr. Cotton? He smiled wider than the Cheshire Cat. I've brought you here, Miss Mueller, to show you a demonstration. A little something to dissuade you should you be inclined to act out. My heart felt as if it would explode at any moment. Whatever he had to show me, I had a gnawing feeling that it was not going to be good. Follow me, Miss Mueller, Dr. Cotton ordered, standing from his desk. I obliged, pushing my chair in and sheepishly tailing behind him. Dr. Cotton led us to a third operating table that I hadn't noticed before. It was shrouded in a blue curtain and the bulb wasn't on. My eyes grew wide as dinner plates when I noticed the dark red liquid pooling around the table's legs. And then I heard a muffled grunt. Dr. Cotton, I squeaked. What's behind that curtain? He grinned devilishly at me, his fiery gaze gleaming with excitement. I'd rather show you than ruin the surprise. He pushed the curtain aside at an angle where I still couldn't see what was behind it and pulled a string dangling from the bulb overhead. The table was showered in light and Dr. Cotton threw back the curtain, making his big reveal. A scream bubbled up from my stomach and died on my lips. It was the man from before, the one who had bashed the woman's skull in. He was strapped to the table with leather belts and he had been rendered unconscious. Dr. Cotton proudly marched up to him, pointing at the dribbling stump where the man's arm had previously been. You see, Miss Mueller, we here at Trenton Psychiatric Hospital believe that to cure an infection of the mind, one must first cleanse the body. This man heinously beat a woman to death with his right arm. Therefore, it needed to be severed in order for him to be saved. Not only that, he continued, much to my dismay, but we believe that the root cause of infection begins with the teeth. I'm sure you've met Samson, yes? He handled that part for me. All I need to do now is dig the remaining shards from his gums and this man will be right as rain. To my horror, Dr. Cotton yanked the man's mouth open, revealing sliced, bleeding gums and a plethora of shattered and broken teeth. I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. I'm truly at a loss for words, I muttered, staggering backwards. Dr. Cotton smiled wider than I thought possible. It was as if the whole thing was a game to him, some twisted joke that only he found amusing. And my expression of terror was the icing on the cake. I think I've made my point abundantly clear, but in case you have not been paying attention, I will reiterate. Cause any trouble and you will end up like this man. Oh, and Elizabeth, you really should visit me every once in a while. I believe that we could have a smashing time, he snarled, his eye traveling up my body before he suddenly erupted into a fit of high-pitched giggles. Mortified is an understatement. I bolted back to the entrance, flinging the door open. Eric's jaw hung open slightly. Nevertheless, he slammed the door shut the instant that I stepped out. After taking a moment for the ordeal to sink in, Eric ushered me down the hall. We proceeded in silence back the way we came until he spoke up. That man, he's the embodiment of evil. I could only bring myself to nod, too shaken by what I had seen to offer a response. Once Eric had led me safely back to the cesspit that was my room, he locked eyes with me, a solemn determination sparking across his visage. Miss Mueller, I'm sorry for this, all of it. You seem like a wonderful person, and I truly do not believe that you belong here. Please, if I can assist you in any way, do not be afraid to ask. I peered up at him, the corners of my mouth involuntarily tugging upward. I couldn't help it. Even in that state, his words left me with a tiny sliver of solace. Thank you, Eric. You're a very kind man. I will surely take you up on that offer. And with that, he returned a smile, and then trudged down the hallway. As I lay on the concrete floor, having opted for the cold, hard ground over the deeply stained mattress, I began to cry. I wailed and sobbed until my eyes were puffy and red, While yes, I had managed to retain my sanity thus far, it had been no more than 6 hours since my arrival, 6 of the worst hours of my entire life. And I had to find a way to survive in that place for months or possibly even years. At that rate, I doubted that I would make it even a week without completely losing my mind. I was startled awake by a loud pounding against my door. "Breakfast," a deep voice grunted. A plastic lunch tray was shoved through a slot at the bottom of my door that I had failed to notice the day prior. It contained a styrofoam cup filled with a dark yellow liquid that I prayed was apple juice, the runniest egg that I had ever laid my eyes on, 2 thin slices of bread and a pair of shriveled sausages, and a hard, moldy orange. "Scrumptious," I muttered, rolling my eyes. After everything I had seen to that point, I was not at all surprised one bit. I decided to stomach what I could, though I wasn't hungry in the slightest. I knew that I seldom would be in that place, but if I was going to stay relatively healthy, I knew that I would need the energy. So I scarfed down most of the contents on my tray, gagging on several occasions. I left the orange for obvious reasons, though. Around 5 minutes later, my door swung open seemingly of its own volition. I cocked my head to the side. Was I beginning to hallucinate already? Had they slipped something into my apple juice? I wandered up to the door to investigate. I peered out into the hall and noticed Eric shuffling away. He turned around, flashing me a grin. "Good morning, Elizabeth. It is okay if I call you that, isn't it?" "Yes, Eric, that's perfectly fine. Good morning," I giggled. I could feel my cheeks flush with color. I'm not sure what it was. Perhaps Eric radiated a sense of security. Perhaps he had struck a chord with me during our chat the previous night. Perhaps I just enjoyed seeing his face. Whatever it was, I couldn't help but return a warm smile. "You'll want to get to your station really quick this morning, Elizabeth. I like to give our higher functioning patients a head start before I let the loonies out," he said, continuing to his destination. "Eric, wait. How am I to know where I'm stationed?" "Oh, right. There should be a piece of paper under your tray with your assignment. I've got it right here too, though. It looks like you'll be doing crafts today. Go to the end of the hall, then take a left. You can't miss it. Let me know if you would like me to, escort you," Eric said, staring at his feet and wringing his hands. I grinned. Eric was beginning to grow on me. "I think I'll be able to manage just fine on my own. Thank you for offering. That was very thoughtful." "And don't mention it," he added, sending me one last smile before returning to his duties. I patted down the filthy corridor in the flimsy shoes that I had been given upon my arrival. If we were to perform tasks during the day, would it kill them to assign a few of us to wash the place every once in a while? Could they at the very least change the light bulbs every decade or so? The lighting was abysmal in there. I reached the end of the hallway and turned left, as instructed, to find a door with a placard labeled Therapy. Lovely, just what I needed. As I would come to learn, the plaque should have been Trauma Department instead. I proceeded into the room, expecting to find a therapist's office. What I actually saw still gives me nightmares. When I pushed the door open, I found a woman sitting at a desk. Her hair was frazzled and her hands were folded neatly across her lap. Her left eye twitched intermittently, but aside from that, she sat completely still, just staring. Hello, I'm here for arts and crafts." The woman's head violently jerked toward me. I took an instinctive step back. Her eyes, they were almost completely red with bursted blood vessels. My heart began to hammer in my chest. Was this a patient or the instructor? "Crafts, oh yes, please take a seat and wait for your classmates to arrive," she said, her lips curling into a devilish grin. "Yes, ma'am." She did not have to tell me twice. I pulled out a green plastic chair from the children's table that I was directed to. That was strange. Once I had a chance to look around, I realized that everything inside the room was geared towards children. A large, colorful rug covered the floor. A Mickey Mouse clock ticked endlessly over the doorway. A wide assortment of toys were piled in the corner. Why did that room exist? A devastating thought suddenly crossed my mind. Did they keep children here? I was pulled from my reverie by the sound of the door creaking open. Patients began to shuffle in, some taking seats at the table around me while others opted to examine the classroom's toy selection. I scanned the group for anyone that I might recognize, anyone that could help me through whatever the instructor had in store. Thankfully, I spotted someone. Robert was one of the final patients to arrive, and I shot him a warm smile. He kept his head low, shuffled over to me, and pulled out a chair. "Robert, I'm so grateful that you're here," I whispered. It felt as if I was a schoolgirl again, as if speaking out of turn would earn me a slap to the back of the hand with a ruler. "Yeah, likewise. We have to be careful. We can't let the Joker over there notice that we know each other. The staff members don't like it when we mingle with other patients. Aside from the caretakers, that is. They aren't paid enough to give it any thought. Power in numbers, I suppose." I nodded, pursing my lips. Understood. We sat there and watched as the remainder of the participants filed through the door. Once the Mickey Mouse clock struck 7 a.m., the wide-eyed instructor rose from her chair. "Attention, class." Most of us perked up, however. A handful of detached individuals in the corner didn't respond, mesmerized by their toys. "Ma'am, I said attention, class," the woman screeched. She fervently smacked the chalkboard behind her, rattling my eardrums and generating a small white cloud of dust. That seemed to do the trick. All eyes were on her. "Please take your seats. My name is Mrs. Calloway, and I will..." The door suddenly opened and a man stepped inside. My stomach twisted into knots when I realized who it was. "Oh, Dr. Cotton, how lovely of you to join us." All of the unruly patients immediately beelined for their seats. I turned to Robert, and his face had drained of color, and he appeared as if he might pass out. "Thank you, Jennifer. I'm pleased to join you." "Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Doctor. Take a seat if you will. We were just about to begin." He nodded and began to make his way over to the table. My heart felt as if it would leap from my chest at a moment's notice. "Not the chair across from me, please, anything but that." Each step that Dr. Cotton took sounded thunderous as his shoes clacked against the tile. I tried to keep my head down, focusing on the patterns in the wooden table before me. Once I heard the footsteps stop, I paused. The entire room had gone eerily silent aside from the blood pounding in my ears. I hesitantly glanced up and nearly leapt out of my skin. Dr. Cotton was towering over me, smiling so wide that I thought the corners of his lips might tear. He loomed menacingly above me for a moment more, before pulling up the chair opposite me and taking a seat. "Hello again, Miss Mueller. I hope that I did not frighten you too terribly with my demonstration last night." "I'm fine," I murmured, averting my gaze. "Then Mr. Schultz," he sneered, turning to Robert. "You've been taking care of yourself, I hope. Your operation seems to have been a massive success," he smirked, indicating Robert's severed digit. "Yes, I believe that I've been cured," Robert muttered, never daring to make eye contact. "Well, I'm glad to hear it. Jennifer," Dr. Cotton said, turning to our manic instructor. "Please do not delay your lesson on my account. I am merely here to observe." "Very well. As I was saying, my name is Mrs. Calloway. I will begin our lesson momentarily, but before I do, I will need to administer a bit of physical therapy. Doctor's orders," she grinned, her eyes darting and frantic. My heart sank. Why had Dr. Cotton joined us? Did the instructor have a few screws loose? What did she mean by physical therapy? The whole thing felt wrong. The depraved woman approached the table and lifted her sundress. I was instantly revolted at what I saw. Fat black sacks of flesh writhed on her torso, pulsating like beating hearts. They appeared slimy to the touch. I wasn't very familiar with the animal kingdom, but I knew exactly what those grotesque parasites were. Leeches. "Each of you will be handed one of the woman shouted, tearing one of the plump masses from her skin. "One of these, and you will allow it to cleanse your blood during our activities." A thin, wiry man suddenly shot up from his seat. "I can't do this, man, not again." He bolted to the door before Mrs. Calloway or Dr. Cotton had a chance to stop him. Not that they tried. The man reached the door without incident and flung it open, and he was greeted by a hulking monstrosity blocking his exit. Samson. "And where do you think you're going?" Samson growled. The man began backing away, holding his hands up. "Look, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand that you're unwilling to follow instructions," Samson snarled, lurching forward and grabbing the man aggressively by his collar. Samson dragged him back to the table as the man kicked and punched the giant's leg, but to no avail. He slammed the terrified man's head onto the table, temporarily immobilizing him. "The patient's ready for treatment, doctor," Samson said, a smile inching across his dry and cracked lips. Dr. Cotton returned his own sinister grin before facing Mrs. Calloway. "You may proceed." She marched up to the man, tightly clutching the wriggling leech. Mrs. Calloway held the bloodsucker to the man's cheek as he squirmed and flailed. The man released a guttural shriek as the parasite sunk its tiny teeth into his flesh. The remainder of us could only stare in shock. No one dared move a muscle. Dr. Cotton and his lackeys had made it painfully obvious what would happen if we did not comply. "Take your seat, and if I see you try to tear that thing off, a puny leech will be the least of your worries," Samson barked, pointing a commanding finger toward an empty chair. The man cowered and scampered off to reclaim his seat. For the remainder of the class, Samson stood against the wall watching over us. His presence alone was enough to keep all of the patients in line. Mrs. Calloway continued around the room, plucking leeches from her body and handing them to each of us. By the time that she was through, small chunks of flesh had been intermittently torn from her abdomen, and she was drenched in blood. The sight of our instructor walking around the classroom giving out lumpy overfed leeches from her torso was one that I would never be able to erase from my memory. When it became my turn to stick the leech to my skin, I glanced at Robert. His was attached to his forearm, and so I decided to follow suit. I winced as the nasty thing burrowed its jaws into my flesh. I felt nothing aside from a slight pain and a tingling sensation. I realized that the man from earlier had greatly exaggerated how painful the experience was. Somehow the remainder of the class was relatively mundane. Aside from my blood slowly being drained from my body and Dr. Cotton's menacing gaze boring into me the entire time, that is. After several hours of coloring and molding figures from clay, we were finally released from the confines of the classroom. By that point, the leeches had sucked up their fill of blood and had naturally detached themselves. Disgusting little creatures, if you ask me. "Class dismissed. Please proceed to the mess hall," Mrs. Calloway said, that sick, wide grin still plastered to her lips. I rose from my chair, itching to escape the predatory gaze of the good doctor. I kept my head down, following closely behind Robert. "Miss Mueller." I stopped in my tracks, my temporary relief shattered. I could see Robert pause for a moment out of my periphery before he continued. "Yes, doctor," I replied, attempting to mask the unease in my tone. "Stay a moment, if you will. There's an important matter that I would like to discuss with you." My heart dropped into my stomach. That was the last thing that I wanted to hear. "Very well," I said, reclaiming my seat as the remainder of the patients filed out of the room. Once the door clicked shut, I found myself trapped in a room with Mrs. Calloway, Sampson, and Dr. Cotton. I felt like a meerkat surrounded by a pack of wild hyenas. Now then, let's get down to business, shall we? Yes, doctor, I'm all ears. He positioned his elbows on the table between us and leaned closer. My head started to spin and I began to feel faint. After our previous encounter, I wanted nothing to do with that man, but unfortunately for me, I had no choice. In case you haven't noticed, I've been observing your behavior. Upon closer inspection, I have reached a conclusion. Would you like to know what that conclusion is, Miss Mueller? A disturbing smile inched across Dr. Cotton's lips. Sampson snickered from his position against the wall. I gulped, a dry lump trundling down my throat. I suppose so, yes. Miss Mueller, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it appears that your psychosis is far more severe than we originally thought. Your behavior has been unruly to say the least. So it has come to my attention that you will require oral surgery in order to correct the issue. Psychosis, unruly behavior. What was he going on about? He was kidding, he had to be. I had followed every command to the letter, and I hadn't exhibited any signs of mental deterioration. It had to have been a joke. Surely there's been some kind of mistake, doctor. I feel completely fine. Furthermore, I'm unaware of the behavioral issues you mentioned. To my knowledge, I have not stepped out of line. Dr. Cotton sighed dramatically, standing from his seat. Oh, do not play coy, Miss Mueller. Sampson has recanted everything to me. This is your official notice to prepare yourself, he said, that shark-like grin returning to his lips. I have scheduled your operation for tomorrow morning. I was numb. Walking through the hallway, receiving my bowl of gruel from the lunch lady right up until Mary waved me over to sit beside her and the rest of the group. I couldn't even begin to process the doctor's words. Oral surgery in the morning for what? I hadn't even been there for a full day and the staff were already preparing to pluck my teeth from my skull. I was in utter shock. Hello, Earth to Elizabeth, Mary said, snapping her fingers in my face. I blinked rapidly and then shifted my focus to my newfound friends. Oh, right, my apologies, my head was in the clouds, I said, taking my seat. So, fill us in on all the details. What did the doctor say to you back there? Robert inquired, eyebrows raised expectantly. Now, give the poor girl a chance to eat. She has to be starving, George said, twisting the ends of his mustache. Yes, I instantly lost my appetite when I laid eyes on the gray, watery mush coagulating before me. Never mind. See, nobody can stomach this slop, not even me, and I'll eat anything. Robert retorted, a smug grin creeping across his face. We can tell, Mary smirked. Robert crossed his arms and scowled at her. Elizabeth, dear, do not feel inclined to tell us anything. Though I will admit that we're all itching to know why the doctor seems so obsessed with you as of late, George confessed, searching my eyes for clues. I sighed. They were going to find out anyway, may as well rip the band-aid off. Dr. Cotton held me back to tell me. I apologize, I need a moment. I choked back the tears threatening to spill down my cheeks before continuing. Dr. Cotton has scheduled me for surgery. Tomorrow morning he plans to remove my teeth. The group's eyes collectively widened, the color draining from their faces. That man is pure evil, Robert whimpered. George, Mary said, maintaining fierce eye contact with him. He quickly averted his gaze. George, she has to come with us. We just can't leave her here, not now. George took a long breath before slowly exhaling. I know I'll need to make some slight alterations, but I believe that everything will still go according to plan. My brows furrowed as I glanced between the pair. Come with you where, may I ask? Man, what is this plan you're referring to? George locked eyes with me, a stern severity overtaking his countenance. He leaned across the table and cupped his hand to my ear. Tonight, we're going to escape. My mouth involuntarily fell open. Did I hear them correctly? How? I asked, still trying to process the revelation. George has powerful contacts. They've arranged for us to start new lives, Mary said, glancing around anxiously. That is correct. Elizabeth, before I extend this offer to you, there's something that I need you to know, George said, his intense stare unwavering. And that is... He paused for a moment, choosing his next words cautiously. This is irreversible. Once we escape, there's no turning back. You will not be able to make contact with anybody from your past life. Nobody can know your whereabouts. You will be given a completely new identity. Is that something you can handle? I bit my lip and broke my gaze. That would mean I would never be able to see my parents again. I was at a crossroads. Start over and never be able to contact my loved ones or stay in that hopeless cesspit, only to be disfigured beyond recognition or worse, on the off chance that I might someday be released. May I have some time to think it over? This is a life-altering decision after all. I understand, but time is not on our side, Elizabeth. I need your answer by the end of recreation time today. That gives you around 5 hours. Look, I know how daunting this is, I really do, but I would strongly advise you to come with us. No good will result from you rotting away in this prison for the rest of your life. You have a real chance at freedom here. George, I said that I will need to consider it. I would appreciate it if you allowed me to do so in peace. He pursed his lips, his eyes falling to the slop on his tray. Very well, I understand. The remainder of our meal was spent in tense silence. George and Mary stared stoically at the table while Robert nervously glanced between the three of us. Needless to say, once it was time to move on to the recreation room, I had still not reached a conclusion. How could I, with a decision of that magnitude? I was understandably conflicted. I soon found myself sitting in one of the rickety, splintered rocking chairs. My cohorts were huddled around me, lost in their own conversation. Oh yeah, I bet I can still play just fine, I'll show you. Robert pouted, glancing down at his nub of a middle finger. Oh, I bet you can't. Have you ever seen a four-fingered guitarist? Nope, neither have I, Mary giggled. There's gotta be at least one out there, and if there isn't, I'll be the first. I will make my dream come. I'll do it. I'll accompany you. Everyone's eyes suddenly shifted to me. Shh, quiet. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. Robert hissed, head on a swivel. Robert is right for once, Mary chimed in. We're all ecstatic that you're coming, but you need to keep your voice down. Right, my apologies. So what are the details? I whispered, my cheeks burning red. I didn't realize that I had been so loud. The weight of the decision must have affected me more than I had initially thought. George claimed the seat to my right. He began to relay the plan to me, never making eye contact in order to appear as discreet as possible, in the event that we had attracted any unwelcome onlookers. We are to execute my scheme once we return to our rooms for the evening. In case you were not aware, all patients must be in their rooms by 9 o'clock sharp. We will wait until exactly 3 minutes past 10. The caretakers will be rotating out with the night guard at that time. Fortunately for us, that guard has been at least 15 minutes late every night for the past year, allowing us a prime opportunity to escape. Are you following thus far? I believe so. But how will we exit our rooms? We are locked in each night, correct? Not jumping the gun a bit there, Elizabeth, George continued, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. We have somebody on the inside who, if I have been informed correctly, is quite fond of you. His name rhymes with stick, if that gives you any indication. I couldn't stop a smile from spreading across my face. Eric, my intuition about him had been spot on. As I was saying, Stick is going to conveniently forget to lock our rooms tonight. We are to convene here. Do you see that emergency exit? I nodded. That is where we will take our leave. It requires a key, but to our immense luck, Mary is taking care of that for us. You see, she has acquired a set of skills that some may deem unethical. Okay, so she's a pickpocket, understood, I said, motioning for him to continue. Once outside, we will need to flee to the driver awaiting our arrival. I will guide you to his position. Following our departure, we will be delivered to a central meeting point where we will be given a vehicle and everything we will need to begin a new life. Afterward, our paths will never cross again. Do you understand? Yes. Then relay everything I just told you. I need to be certain that we can pull this off correctly. I sighed. Fine. We are to meet here at exactly 3 minutes past 10. Wait, how are we to know the time? Our rooms do not come furnished with clocks. And good catch, see, this is why I wanted to review it again. Place your hand behind my chair and open it. I obliged, trying to draw as little attention to myself as possible. Something cold and metallic fell into my grasp. Mary managed to snag that for you earlier today. Please continue. I stole a glance at the object in my hand. A shiny golden pocket watch glimmered back at me. Once we meet here, you unlock the door and we make a break for it. We pile into the waiting vehicle and begin our new lives. Did I leave anything out? Quite a bit actually, but you've retained the important points. In a few short hours, we will all be free once again. A battle of emotions waged within me at those words. Rage mingled with sadness which dissolved into solemn reflection. Would we truly be free, forced to remain hidden from the world and those who cared about us the most? That did not seem like freedom to me, but it was worlds better than the alternative. We bided the remainder of our time discussing trivial matters such as whether or not cigarettes have negative health effects. Hats off to George, he pinned the tail on the donkey there. Once rec time was complete, I was sent to bread baking. The entire time my heart was beating like a drum. I waited on pins and needles for some strange incident to befall the class, but to my surprise, nothing did. I steadied my breathing as I walked down the grungy corridor and back to my room. This was it. Just over an hour and I would never be subjected to live in such a squalor ever again. My mind raced as I lay on the hard ground beside my mattress. I couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. I had spent a tad over 24 hours in the most run-down, dysfunctional facility on the planet, and I was already about to take part in a prison break of sorts. It was an unbelievable set of circumstances, yet there I was, seeing them to fruition. I suddenly knocked my brain back into focus, glancing at the stolen pocket watch. 10:02. I had less than a minute left until my salvation. The hands on the watch moved agonizingly slowly. Tick-tock, tick-tock. 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1. The time had finally arrived. I crept up to the door and cautiously pushed it open, peering in both directions. I was met with an empty hallway. Perfect. I sprinted to the rec room as fast as my legs could carry me, the soles of my cheaply made shoes slapping against the floor as I went. I pushed open the doors and there they were. Mary, Robert, and George were all standing by the exit awaiting my arrival. Is everybody ready? I will need you all to run like your lives depend on it. Especially you, Robert. Have I made myself clear? Hey, yeah, whatever, I got it. Good. Then you will lead the charge. You are sure to fall behind due to your lack of stamina, so it is imperative to place you in the front. Once I unlock this door, you bolt for it. Sheesh, George, point taken. The new me'll go on a die, okay? Just unlock the frickin' door already, will ya? George nodded, producing a shiny silver key. He inserted it into the lock and shoved the door open with all his might. Robert put his head down and ran as fast as he could. For about half a second. Robert's face slammed straight into a stark white uniform. Samson grinned as he snatched Robert by the neck, holding a rusted kitchen knife to his throat. My eyes grew wide and I nearly regurgitated my dinner. No, we were so close, this couldn't be happening. Samson forced Robert back into the room before the door could slam shut. Somebody followed him inside. Dr. Cotton's manic grin looked more depraved than I had ever seen it. His single eye bulged and he appeared as if he were about to burst into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. "Did you really think you would make your escape by adhering to such a harebrained scheme? Surely you had to think of the consequences." I glanced at my acquaintances for reassurance, I suppose. Needless to say, I would receive none. Mary's mouth hung agape and George stared solemnly at his feet. A dark stain began to blossom around Robert's private area. We were done for. And who of the sorry lot of you would have concocted such a flimsy plan? Perhaps it was the pickpocket, Dr. Cotton cooed, smiling at Mary. She instantly averted her gaze. Or perhaps our most recent addition. Such a shame, I was beginning to take a liking to you. Dr. Cotton's menacing glare bore into me, sending a shiver into my spine. No, I think we're all well aware of whose idea this was. It certainly did not arise from that nitwit's puny excuse for a brain. He grinned, motioning to Robert. So that only leaves one option. Dr. Cotton purred, running a fingernail down the outline of George's jaw. The murder. George suddenly leapt into action, spinning the doctor around and pressing a crudely made shank to his neck. "I care to finish your statement, doctor. The what? I had a bit of trouble hearing you." Dr. Cotton's gleeful expression melted into one of pure fear. He had lost the upper hand. "Oh, what's wrong?" George snarled, a wicked grin inching across his lips. "Cat got your tongue." Dr. Cotton began babbling incoherently. I couldn't be certain if he was jumbling his words to spite George or if it was a genuine reaction produced by unabated terror. "Well, now that the jig is up, I might as well reveal while I'm here," George growled. There was a malevolence to his tone that made my skin crawl. It was almost as if he had transformed into an entirely different person. The man that I knew to be calm and composed now appeared manic and depraved. It frightened me to see him in that state. To satiate everybody's curiosity, George began forcing Dr. Cotton closer to the exit. I was admitted to Trenton Psychiatric Hospital on account of the jury's verdict. I was deemed unfit to stand trial on 7 counts of murder by reason of insanity. George began to cackle maliciously as he shuffled closer and closer to the door. "Stop! Have you forgotten about your little friend here? I'll kill him if you take one more step," Samson shouted. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead and the knife trembled slightly in his grasp, much to Robert's dismay. "Oh, you wouldn't dare. Not if you value your precious doctor's life, that is." It seemed that Dr. Cotton had gone completely mute by that point, though he vehemently shook his head. "Come to think of it, ladies, why don't you go on ahead? I'll be with you shortly." Mary took my hand and began dragging me to the door. I was still shell-shocked after George had dropped the murder bomb. The entire situation was utterly insane. "You can't go, I'll kill him, I will," Samson shrieked as we proceeded to the door. "Robert, best of luck, and you," Mary said, turning to Dr. Cotton. "You can rot." She spat into his only good eye, rendering him temporarily blind. Mary flipped the middle finger to Samson as she led me out the door. It felt wrong to leave George and Robert there, yet I knew that it was the safest option. The fewer people in harm's way, the better. I suddenly found myself outside next to Mary. The chirping of crickets and the buzz of cicadas filled my ears. The only light emitted from the building to our backs and the street lamps before us. For a fleeting moment, I was whisked away from all the madness. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to feel the gentle caress of the summer breeze sweeping through my hair. It was heavenly. But then reality came barreling back like a runaway freight engine. Elizabeth, I need you to look at me," Mary said, placing her hands on my shoulders, her eyes meeting mine. "Whatever happens, the moment George walks out of that building, we need to run like the wind, okay? Can you do that for me?" I pursed my lips and nodded. I had to. I was certain that if we were caught, one way or another, none of us would make it out of that institution alive. We suddenly heard a muffled commotion erupt from behind the door that we had just exited from. Shouting and what sounded like violent stabbing drifted to our ears. "Get ready," Mary whispered. A clang. George crashed through the door, his face drenched in crimson. "Go, go, go," he screamed as he sprinted past us. Mary and I immediately followed suit. "Where's Robert?" Mary shouted amidst the chaos. "It didn't make it, it's just us now," George replied. Without warning, we heard a sickening crash from somewhere behind us. Samson had flung open the door so hard that he had nearly knocked it off its hinges. Blue, angry veins bulged from his temple, and upon locating us, he immediately gave chase. I focused on running, willing my legs to move faster, and I spared a glance back only once. My eyes grew wide. Samson was rapidly closing the distance. "There!" George shouted, to my immense relief. A jet black 58 Chevy Biscayne sat idling beneath a street lamp. We just had to keep pushing a bit further. George was the first to reach the vehicle. He leapt into the passenger seat, leaving Mary and me to fend for the back. Mary had fallen behind me, so I flung the door open and dove to the driver's side, leaving ample room for her. I turned to Mary and my heart dropped into my stomach. Samson was nearly arm's length away. He was foaming at the mouth, itching to catch up to her before she reached her salvation. "Come on, Mary, you can do this." I said a silent prayer that she would be all right. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. I watched in both horror and anticipation as with one final push, Mary leapt into the back seat beside me. The driver didn't wait for her to shut the door before our tires squealed against the asphalt. I breathed a sigh of relief and began helping Mary upright. "I'm so glad that you... Mary? My adrenaline roared back like a tidal wave and my heart felt as if it would burst from my chest at a moment's notice. Samson had jumped onto the back of the car. He had a death grip on Mary's ankle and he was desperately trying to yank her from the vehicle. I instantly grabbed Mary's arms and pulled with all my might. "George, a little help here," Mary shouted, holding back tears. Samson's fingernails were embedded deep into her skin, drawing blood. "Oh my, what a predicament," George said, finally taking notice of the scene behind him. "This should do the trick." He produced the bloody shank we had seen moments prior and began bludgeoning Samson's hand with it. He yowled in pain and instinctively retracted it. We wasted no time in slamming the door shut. "You can't hide from me. You won't get away with this," Samson shouted, banging his fists against the glass. The driver stomped on the brakes, sending the behemoth flying over the hood of the car. Samson lay sprawled out in the street, his right leg twisted at an odd angle. The driver simply swerved around him and continued on our path. Once everybody had a chance to get their bearings, an eerie silence overtook the atmosphere. The tension was palpable. "So," George began, "Mary Elizabeth, I forgot to introduce you. This is Pierre, Why did you leave him?" All the emotion had drained from Mary's voice, leaving it flat and monotone. "Why did I leave who?" "George, don't give me that. You know exactly who. I have a pretty good idea of what you did back there. You cut the manic doctor's throat and then you ran. You left Robert to die." George glanced at her momentarily, the light gleaming off his glass eyeball. Mary threw her hands over her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. You killed him." Mary continued to weep. I numbly rubbed her back, coming to the same realization. Mary was right. That was George's plan all along. From the moment those two had foiled our scheme, George knew that Robert was going to die. "I will hear none of that," George hissed, a hint of sorrow creeping in amongst the rage as he spoke. "I did what had to be done. Robert was my friend too, believe me. I would have saved him had there been any other way." "Oh, you could have saved him, we all could have. Maybe if we had just let them take us, if we had stayed and come up with another plan, a better plan, maybe then he would." Mary, you know as well as anyone that letting those two apprehend us was not an option. We would have been dead by the morning. As much as I hate the reality of it, Robert is gone and we have to accept that." Mary didn't respond. She cried and cried until she had no tears left. My heart shattered for her. I knew they were close, but I hadn't realized how much she had truly cared for Robert until that moment. I'd be lying if I told you that I didn't shed a few tears of my own, for both their sakes. The remainder of the ride is a blur. At some point, we stopped to clean ourselves up and change clothes. George assured us that our psychiatric garments would be burned to dispose of the evidence. Shortly afterward, we were brought to a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. Each of us was given an Oldsmobile, a week's worth of clothing, enough money to last a year, documentation for our new identities, and directions to separate safe houses, where we had been instructed to lay low for 6 months. Thank you, George. You didn't have to include me in your plans. I will be forever grateful to you for that," I said, extending my hand. George readily accepted it, returning a hearty handshake. "Make no mention of it. I wouldn't dream of leaving you." We both turned to Mary, who was staring at the ground. She gazed up at us, her eyes puffy and red. "George, I will never forgive you for what you did to Robert, but you managed to free us, so I suppose I should thank you." "I understand. It's been a pleasure to get to know both of you. I hope that you will lead long and prosperous lives." If only we had met under different circumstances. "Take care of yourselves," I said, offering a wave. The pair nodded and headed to their respective vehicles, never for our past to cross again. It's been over 65 years since that day. In that time, I followed the instructions to the letter. I eventually came out of hiding and started a family under my new alias. I never told my husband about my past life. To his dying day, he never knew who I truly was. Sadly, I lost him 4 years ago after a lengthy battle with leukemia. Raymond was a good man, nothing at all like Alan. I was never able to visit my parents again. That was the most difficult part, knowing that they were out there longing for me to return home, only for their prayers to fall on deaf ears. I wrote many letters to them, but I never managed to drop them off. My parents had moved a year or so after my disappearance from the asylum, and I'd been unable to locate them since. That's my biggest regret in life, one that still clings to me even in my old age. As for the others, I read in the newspaper that Mary was discovered in 1962 after she got into a bar fight. She was sent back to Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. I could find no records of her after that time. As far as I know, George was never found. His wealthy connections ensured that he would remain undetected, unless he seriously slipped up. As for Robert, I can only pray that he was given a proper burial. May his soul eternally rest in peace.